afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the Schiller Institute for giving me the opportunity to present my research at the François Gervais University of Tours. These works have been published in English in the International Journal of Modern Physics and in French by editor Albin Michel. The essence of my investigation can be reduced to a single question. Does the real climate validate the virtual climate models? We will develop here in particular the fact that scaremongering, the climate scaremongering, is not based on scientific measures, but exclusively on the projections of climate models that extrapolate data till the end of the century. Hence the importance of the question, are they validated by scientific observations?
La Banque mondiale.
The World Bank. The World Bank, as everyone knows, an expert institution in matters of climate, recently evaluated the costs against the carbon dioxide, CO2, emitted by combustion of such fossil fuels as coal, oil, natural gas, or shale gas. The cost of that fight, according to the World Bank, is evaluated at $89,000 billion. In other terms, $16 billion per day between now and 2030. This gigantic effort is supposed to limit the warming of our planet due to greenhouse gas emissions below the 2 degrees Celsius level. In front of such a challenge, the first thing to check is to inquire if in the recent past CO2 emissions have really provoked a rise in temperature. Now you have this in front of your eyes, and the correlation is far from being evident, since temperatures lowered while emissions started increasing, and temperature from their side increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius between 1910 and 1945, by 0.6 degrees, while in those days emissions were still weak. And between 1970 and 1998, while the emissions were 6 times greater, temperature rose highly. So therefore the correlation is not self-evident. Which are the greenhouse gases in the air? The answer is simple. Those whose molecules are composed by at least 2 different atoms. The main one is water vapor, from far. Then, far behind water vapor stands CO2. Its concentration in the air went from 0.3% to 0.04% in 1 century. What can be the impact of this increase on the Earth's temperature? More precisely, what has been its impact on temperature as measured by satellites positioned at 17 kilometers altitude? Why this altitude? Because it is in the higher part of the atmosphere, i.e. the lower stratosphere, the region where atmospheric pressure is the weakest, that the greenhouse theory anticipates detecting the clearest signature. By contrast, on the Earth's surface level, the pressure is more elevated and the effect is already close to saturated. De facto, temperature isn't rising significantly or measurably inside the limits of experimental certitude since nearly 20 years. Between 1993 and 2015, that you see in front of you, the level of CO2 in the air went from 355 parts per million, 355 parts per million, ppm, thus, to 400 ppm, i.e., half of the total increase since the beginning of the industrial age of the 19th century. What was its impact on temperature? You see it here, 0. No measurable evolution has been observed. Conclusion, the theory of the atmospheric greenhouse is not verified by scientific measurements. And it is on the basis of this non-valid theory that the climate models anticipating a global warming of the planet, which are based. As Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, if a theory is not confirmed by experience, it is wrong. Whoever has proposed it, if it's not confirmed by experience, it's false. Was global warming observed on the surface of the Earth? Yes. But it originated in part from a cyclical phenomenon. We went from the highest point of a 60-year cycle, and now temperature is gradually decreasing. This is visible if one zooms in on the last measurements of the British Hadley Centre and correlates them with measurements obtained by various satellites in the lower box. No climate model adopted by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has anticipated this negative evolution. Admittedly, since the tendency observed remains below the range of fluctuations, the issue needs a follow-up. The media, always prompt to announce records, did they announce the last record of the size of the sea ice of Antarctic, pulverized on September 21st, 2014? It surpassed the last record size of 2013 by a surface equal to the sea ice to the surface of France. Why this silence? The Arctic sea ice melted till 2012. Normal, since we went beyond the high point of a cycle during the first decennium of the century. But look how fast the volume of ice, the blue boxes, at its minimum, end of last summer, grew again this last year, while the alarmists predicted it would disappear since last summer. This was Al Gore. In reality, the total surface of sea ice, there's a curve down to the left, the total surface of sea ice became again, has a surplus since 2.5 years, contradicting in this way the climate models adopted by the IPCC. In effect, where is the impact of CO2 emissions since the surface area of the sea ice has become once again in a surplus? This cycle of about 60 years demonstrates itself not only in matters of temperature and the variations of surface area of sea ice, but also on the rise of ocean levels. The data here are those of the figure 314 of the AR5 report of the IPCC, here compared to the 60-year cycle. In the two reports that I sent to the IPCC beginning and later 2012, I indicated them references to this cycle and published it by international scientific journals. It is therefore with full knowledge that the IPCC made the choice to ignore the natural variability in its report. In science, this is called cherry picking, selective choice, not science.
Alors, parce qu'ils ignorent
Once you ignore this cycle,
les modèles
the models CMIP3, CMIP5 of the IPCC reports are incapable of identifying the climate of the past, in particular the rise of 0.6 degrees between 1910 and 1945. It's blatant. They diverge equally from the measurements made since the beginning of this century, as we shall now examine in detail. First remark. Look at this forest of spaghettis. All these models that disagree among each other, including those adopting the same scenario of emissions. Second remark. Since the temperature didn't rise since the end of the last century, their projections are systematically above the measurements. And finally, no model ever anticipated the small decline of temperature measured by the most precise instruments humanity has today, the satellites, since 2002. If this decline continues and eventually amplifies, let's bet that the climate modelizers will be in deep trouble, and even more, the politicians who have gouged their careers on the IPCC predictions. The models consider various scenarios of CO2 emissions. But what do measurements teach us about that? They show that the yearly increase of CO2 in the air varies from one year to another. It can be only of 0.1% or reach 0.75%. The yearly increase is low when the Earth is momentarily colder. It is much bigger when the Earth is under the influence of a warm temperature fluctuations. Like El Niño, the blue curve represents the fluctuations of temperature. The increase of CO2 is a green curve, and it follows as its shadow, arriving 9 to 11 months later. Without exploring all possible interpretations, which the IPCC likes to ignore, even when the critical proofreader invites to discuss the matter, which I was, we must ask what is the yearly average increase of CO2 in the air? Close to 0.5% per year since 20 years. At that pace, the rate will be far from having doubled at the end of this century. The climate sensibility, in English, the transient climate response, is defined as the rise of temperature in case of the doubling of the rate of CO2 in the air. The IPCC reports it will be comprised between 1 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. But figure 11.25, or the report, considers the lowest temperature as the most probable. This judgment isn't taken up in the summary to the attention of decision makers. 3 articles more recent than the AR5 report indicate a climate sensibility comprised between 0.6 degrees and 1.4 degrees, comforting the low value of the IPCC. At the current rate of 0.5 degree yearly increase of CO2 over the last 20 years, a simple calculation indicates a temperature rise between 0.3 degrees and 0.6 degrees to the year 2100. Should we all scream catastrophe? Between Friday, June 5th and Saturday, June 6th, temperature in France dropped by 15 degrees in 24 hours. The southern wind turned north. Women in nice light clothes returned to their pullovers overnight. But will we really feel a virtual increase by 0.3 to 0.6 degrees over a whole century? The real global warming came to an end.
Les émissions de CO2,
the CO2 emissions, which continue with the same speed,
5% par an, ne peuvent donc
cannot
plus
therefore be accused any
cela
longer.
tienne.
Lo and behold,
Le bouc
as a
émissaire,
scapegoat,
on accuse le
CO2
de
is
tout
accused to be
et
responsible of
n'importe quoi.
everything and everything.
tempêtes, des
Storms,
ouragans,
hurricanes,
des sécheresses,
drought,
des
inundations,
des vagues
waves
de
of cold in the
froid aux
United
États-Unis, au
States
Canada.
and Canada.
Et même
And in the
dans
same
l'enthousiasme
reign of momentary
des
enthusiasm, tsunamis and earthquakes, all blamed on CO2.
Pourtant,
Hence,
les mesures montrent
the measurements show that accumulated cyclonic energy has a tendency to decrease, accumulated cyclonic energy,
comme on le constate,
as one can see on the blue curve over the last 20 years. Torricelli invented the barometer 3 centuries ago.
il a vite remarqué
He readily saw that lower air pressure
qu'une pression faible annonçait la pluie,
announced rain,
qu'une pression
and that
plus faible encore,
even lower pressure announced wind and even a storm.
pour une pression moyenne,
With a
le temps reste incertain.
medium pressure, the weather remains uncertain and
En
variable.
revanche, une pression élevée,
On the opposite side, high pressure inaugurates nice, stable weather. Did we forget all of that?
je débattais
A minister with whom I confronted during a debate on French radio RTL did forget. I told him that on a simple thermometer, there figures no indication saying storm, rain, wind. These indications are reported through a barometer, to which he told me that I was not a scientist.
Alors pour finir,
And finally,
et je le rappelle
And I-
fois, car surtout ceux
all those who pretend to be greens
semblent avoir
because they have a tendency to forget it,
à l'oublier. Le CO2
CO2 is, through photosynthesis and via the production of glucose, C6H1206, a sugar, a
indispensable,
foodstuff indispensable and irreplaceable for vegetation, especially nutritive plants, harvests,
tout en régénérant l'oxygène de l'air.
and at the same time regenerates the oxygen in the air. The CO2 in the air increased over a century from 0.03 to 0.04%. Is that too much or too little?
Dans l'hémisphère nord,
In spring and in summer, in the northern hemisphere, one observes each year a drop
le taux de CO2 dans l'air,
of CO2 in the air,
consommé par une végétation en croissance,
consumed by an outburst of growth of seasonal vegetation. The amplitude of that drop has increased between 1969 and 2013, as measured in this graphic at La Jolla
a surtout augmenté
in California. This amplitude has increased faster than the rate of CO2 itself, proof that vegetation seems always in need
son
of its preferred food.
Cet effet
This effect is collateral
est donc
and eminently beneficial for mankind.
le bénéfice de
The benefits of the higher yields of harvest has been even calculated at 3,000 billion euros since 1961. So why should we fight it while the minuscule effect on temperature doesn't seem to object this increase of yields in harvests?
En conclusion,
To conclude,
plus de
let me say this. More than 1,350 articles in international scientific journals
réchauffement supérieur à 2 degrés
excluding all risk of warming beyond 2%, and they all underline the natural variability of the climate. The number of these articles has doubled since 2007, and the number of 1,350 is to be compared with the 1,637 articles of the data web of science by crossing keywords anthropogenic and greenhouse or CO2 and warming.
D'autres articles
Other articles, generally considered in the direction, going in the direction of the conclusions of the IPCC, do nothing more than report the observations the scientists are using, as I have done, to demonstrate there is no correlation between temperature and atmospheric CO2, or to simulate the impact on such and such ecosystem if the temperature rises by 2, 3, 4 degrees, etc. If the temperature rises, let's be reassured, it is not rising any longer. Scaremongering and catastrophism is uniquely based on projections of climate models. By definition, every model, being a model, is more or less wrong. In the case of climate models, the climate sensibility, TCR, is reportedly between 0.6 and 2.5 degrees. It means they are disagreeing among each other and recognize an uncertainty rate of 2.5 to 0.6, i.e., 417%. The most alarmist of them are not validated by scientific measurements. Should we trust them? While the evolution of the real climate does not really appear worrying. Thank you.